The mechanism of the sorcerers engaged in the witchcraft in order to defraud the records includes the function of the assault, uh, perpetually by the surveillance, which is referred to as no touch, but is the exchange of having shot out specific types of bullets, of waves, or something along these lines, depending upon the exact piece of secret equipment, would actively change, and thus it would create the function of radiotoxicity or waste. And to this extent, you would have the systems of perpetual enfeeblement and assaults and triggers, at which point these active functions, having been trained specifically as hybrid warfare, have engaged in the function of actively controlling the general society in the subversion in their war against the Constitution, including the function of giving women breast cancer by the x rays from the surveillance, which engages in the perpetuity of them being watched in those particular areas, which breeds the cancer, which generates their change for the various arguments, which would be anything except for what they're actually doing. As the function of the Confederacy continues exponentially under these functions, the illusions generate their connections with the female Gnostics, who are silly girls who would not be developed enough in order to know what it is they actually want, and thus they would make foolish wishes and thus engage in the function of the control on the black market as they exacerbate and break their political parties political influence, systematically creating the position where they are at fault for their abusers, which is something that is set up by the deal with the devil when they engage in their connection with the surveillance sorcerers. To this extent, their advantages are systematically set up so that they would conduct the scams where they would fail, and the function of their failure creates the hit back liability, and thus the function of them being at fault for the thing that they would be historically complaining about, and thus the action of them being guilty and thus punished as a consequence of reality existing allows itself to work into reality, and thus they become their own worst enemies, and thus each target is exponentially an expansion of this pretense, with the warlocks' connections with the witches for the female narcissists in order to be advantaged on this so they could systematically collapse the influence of each political identity, which is subversive, as the engagement of all rights to all people is derivative as a collective identity in its full diversity and uniqueness, and thus the diversity becomes the strength when all are respected under the pretense of the collective law, which is the depository of their sovereign authority. And to this extent, the identity politics becomes the subdivisions of each of these functions, which systematically become the target of those warlocks in order to guarantee that they are their own worst enemies, as they are systematically dismantled by their foolish wishes. And when the gods wish to punish someone, they give them exactly what they want. And thus, the action of them conducting various crimes in order to have supported their wishes as a support structure, it then becomes automated and normalized for the destruction of the collective society as they become the abusers and thus become guilty of the thing that they would historically be complaining about, and thus they become the victim in order to blame, and thus the creation of more victims, and thus the collapse of society, which has then been sold to the adversaries under this mechanism, proving each of the progress under the abuse theaters as an advanced reality TV segment, generating the pretense of the viability of each of the sales, guaranteeing that the profits from the treason in the deal with the devil allows for the collapse of the collective system, which they escape under their contracts with the deal with the devil or with the enemy, creating the position where they engaged in taking the resources from that scam and buggering off before the collapse and thus missing it under the position under of the devil magic such as the ones referred to by James Lindsay in the pendulum. The pendulum swings in one way and they dodge and miss it, and it swings the other way and they dodge and miss it. They set up a series of false extremes and then they make sure that it doesn't hit them. They scam and they leave, and then it goes to the other side and they scam and they leave, and it goes to the other side, and the pendulum goes both ways, and society engages in a spiral down as it collapses on itself, as they're systematically proving that they are their own worst enemy. And in that system, they guarantee the impossibility of any male leadership, as the Protocols of Learned Elders of Zion has asserted from their development when they made the Jewish victims the party that are guilty of the crimes against the Jews. They engaged in the function of them having to accept the action of the protocols in order to make them injured, and thus the act of accepting this position facilitates the injury to their community as a primary example. And to this end, you generate historic animosities, which then are then imploded onto themselves as they systematically destroy everything around them, funding the people that are hurting them while they are given the capacity or the equipment to hurt themselves. And those most prone towards hurting themselves and others are the ones most readily provided the option by their contracts with their enemy, which prevents the possibility of male leadership under the aristocracy function, such as David Bowles, as the American Patriarchy, from their original position, which compels Congress to engage in decision or lose all control for their political influences, lest David form his political party and become the only viable political party, as the rest of them race to the bottom, as they've already finalized their answer. Under the wizard communism, they've committed crimes, knowing all of the various opportunities, including what happens if they don't do their crimes, certifying their final answers in the race to the bottom. Now, that against the competition of David's party would have lost, which means David would have owned the American political landscape and been in full control over the United States under the mechanisms of the corruption by the Confederacy, but exclusively loyal to the United States as its supreme overlord. Or they can engage in the function of making him intelligence oversight and dedicating him to national security, engaging in the function of giving him the equivalent status as the top ranked general or six-star general of the intelligence oversight, specifically connected to Congress, exponentially advancing according to those interests, which would then facilitate him becoming the power broker, which would then facilitate him managing the political landscape for the other political parties, making them viable. With the materialization of the patriarchy, the engagement of male leadership existing facilitates their capacity to have had their successes, as the mistakes derivative of not having that there is the thing injuring them. And they systematically complain about having to be women that have to be in control of everything, which is the correct answer because, on the one hand, they don't have any male leadership, and thus the engagement of them systematically be put in the danger being surrounded by predators who are trying to extort them under a ranching position where the rancher engages in the function of having captured them and thus manipulate them and thus exploit them in various senses, that if they do not engage in the discipline of the self-development, then they are going to be completely dismantled and thrown away. And thus the engagement requires them to have the male leadership, which isn't available to them, which systematically makes them anxious, which constantly keeps them distracted, which prevents them from recognizing it whenever it exists, as there are so many insufferable frauds about, which are actually predatory and extremely dangerous to them. And they are the ones that are viewed primarily as the ones that would be considered the good guys, and everyone amongst the fraudulent system who has been promoted as the viable option for the thing is the more dangerous variant of the thing, as they engage in the function of the subversion by the Confederate position of no remedy to one of their crimes, forcing out the possibility of non-violent contest in order to settle the affairs, compelling the engagement of crimes versus crimes in a tit-for-tat function as the Druid religion is hyper-accelerated through the Confederacy, engaging in their criminal subtleties under the function of Ololth, which has added the activity of trying to acquire all of the things that you can at the destruction of others without the capacity of getting caught, less the function of the retaliation, which is extraordinarily severe, destroy you in its entirety. Thus you have the function of perfect chaos and perfect anarchy, which consumes the very construct of all social identities, and thus in this engagement they point out that everyone else is dangerous, but everyone else is dangerous, which they've accepted as the preferred thing, putting themselves into danger, and thus did not do necessary precautions in order to be safe because they wanted everything inside of the danger zone, which they needed to create in order to acquire those items, which could only be manifest in the danger zone, which they would go into on purpose, and thus become their own worst enemy, and thus are guilty of the thing, and thus the victim is to blame in that scenario, with all of the illusions dissolved. To this extent, they, having done it to themselves, are the only ones to blame. And all of these extraordinary illusions generate in perpetuity the facts of their active rebellion against law and order and God and everything connected to those things, at which point their absolute allergic nature to any masculinity derives their fake masculinity by the man children who, having never grown up or received any competent disciplines in their lives, were never able to have made anything of themselves in a free market, requiring them to survive under the crutches of the white supremacist communism. To this extent, in infinitum, are in active rebellion against the Constitution and its government, and thus the hierarchy derived by competitions such as the masculine contests with each other, as they constantly engage in the function of making each other better by the act of making the contest, by the act of making the practices, in order to hyper accelerate these contests, which generates this series of winners and the levels of winning, which creates the hierarchy, which has normalized the function in society, which is recognized under the free market from the terrorist position, the motive of their attacking of David as the patriarchy, or the highest level of the male hierarchy for the male leadership. And with the existence of the male leadership is the disillusionment of the Confederates' sorcery, and to this extent the end of their fraud against the courts, and thus the disillusionment of all of their crimes, and thus everything that they have been avoiding in secrecy by the punishment of their goddess derives the full latitude of the severity, as they will no longer be able to hide what they are to their god, which has provided them liberty from the god of nature, where society, which they parasitically seek to destroy, has created, and thus the engagement of the internal conflict of their core identity and the realization of their natural inferiority has derivative that negative emotion and has turned it into a necrotic damage by which to retaliate against all others as the core mechanism of their sorceries, for those illusions generating their venom against all naturally superior in society, which have to be destroyed by virtue of dissolving the illusion that they have anything to offer, and to this extent that potent hatred compounds infinitum and for all eternity. Now, this generates the position for their compounding illusions and their false posturing to the end where they have to engage in this posturing for the division of their various crimes, which have been automated, and thus the active use of the crimes in a function of proving their status amongst the Confederacy. Thus, the use of secret societies and their occult functions say that someone has to commit a crime in order to be a part of the secret society, so that the secret society has something over their head that they would be punished for, and thus the severity of the punishment keeps them loyal to the group, and thus prevents them from telling the truth, and thus the action of not betraying their group lest they receive the retaliation from their goddess. And to these positions actively generate the position of their contests, and their hierarchy derived by these contests facilitate their ability to engage in various subversions in the childish sorcery, and thus the engagement of being able to destroy someone arbitrarily becomes an attractive thing. And thus, if someone actually beats them on the thing where they're trying to brag, they get angry and increase their retaliation, and thus it becomes deep-seated malice inside of their hearts in order to gain the retaliation, as they systematically are losing, making them more and more angry. And thus the person is either utterly destroyed by virtue of the malice from the disqualified actions and setups, or the person becomes generically hated by everyone connected to the sorcerer's magic network, and to this extent is then maliciously abused and defamed throughout that network, facilitating the extraordinary injuries in perpetuity in the systems of permanent retaliation without due process as a function of its own end, and thus the action of it not having been admitted to means it cannot be submitted to the courts, as they have blocked all of the evidence and criminalized the evidence, have engaged in the function of permanently engaging in punishments without due process, as the Constitution is, was, and will continue to be the core idea of everything they have ever hated. And thus, that becomes their entire identity. Just a big, fat, black, degenerate, necrotic energy of malice. And if that ball of malice cannot acquire what it wants, then it then engages in the subversion by their strawman arguments for all of the various gimmicks where they engage in the cutscenes, where they just ignore the contest in its entirety, as contests are for men and they don't make those. Thus, the engagement of the cutscene allows them to just continue as normal under whatever various fraud they are seeking to disseminate against the courts, and thus permanently establish a misunderstanding in the records, as the court of public opinion systematically becomes polluted by virtue of their taint. Thus, the capacity to have captured someone inside of this malice network generates a position for the systems of not being able to sustain themselves under the distractions, and thus engages in the activity of defamation against them in the courts of record and the court of public opinion by virtue of the kidnapping. And thus, the act of having held the person inside the simulation is an act of defamation, and that defamation creates various injuries, permanent and non-permanent, and they compound exponentially, at which point the crime against the destruction of the person's time having been destroyed is considered a permanent injury, as the time is not something that they can have returned to them, merely paid for, and thus under these exchanges increases the viability of their destruction of the economy, as if they destroy the idea of the money, then the financial remedy becomes muted under that potential, as the only payment having been mitigated or decreased in value by inflation is then non a viable thing, and thus increases the malice from the Hatredcopter, engages in the permanent retaliations as the satisfaction of their permanent identity.